If you have clicked on this video, then I am sure you are considering whether or not to apply for disability benefits for your child. On this video, I'm going to address the non-medical and medical requirements for childhood disability under Social Security standards. I will go over the framework by which Social Security determines whether or not a child meets their definition of disability. And some of that is going to get a little bit technical, but my hope is to give you as a parent or a guardian enough tools to help you determine whether or not a claim for child benefits would ultimately be successful. I will also address what happens when your child turns 18, and I will specifically address autism and childhood disability at the end of the video. Hi friends, welcome back to my channel for Georgia Advocate Partners. If we haven't met before, my name is Jennifer Jarvis and I am a Social Security disability attorney. On this channel, I have made it my mission to pull back the curtain and demystify what is going on at the Social Security Administration when you apply for benefits for yourself, or as in this case, for your child. And of course, as always, nothing here should be construed as creating an attorney-client relationship, and this is not legal advice, but I do highly encourage you to seek out an attorney for your particular case. With that said, on to the video. So when we talk about childhood disability benefits, we need to first start off with the understanding that child benefits are an SSI benefit. SSI stands for Supplemental Security Income, and the funding for this type of benefit comes from the general United States Treasury funds under what we call Title 16. This means that the childhood benefit is what we call means tested. So that means that not only must your child meet the medical criteria for disability, there are also non-medical criteria under income and assets. So let's take a look at that. Because it is the parent's role to support a child, the Social Security Administration will look at parental assets and income. SSI has rules about those assets. So if you are part of a married couple with a child, then your assets as a family cannot be more than $5,000. That's $3,000 that go to the married couple and $2,000 that are allocated to the child. So in total, that's $5,000. If you are a single parent, then under SSI rules, you cannot have more than $4,000 in assets, because what happens is $2,000 get allocated to the single parent and $2,000 get allocated to the child. If you have more than that, then you do not qualify for SSI. Now, when Social Security is looking at those assets, they do not count the house that you live in, and they do not count one car. But if you're in a family situation, you probably have two cars that run. And if you do, then that extra car will probably put you over that $5,000 limit. The Social Security Administration does not look at some types of money that the parents have put into retirement or pension funds. But if you have, for example, a savings account with $6,000 sitting in it, then your child would not qualify for those benefits. I'm also going to put an asterisk here as well, that if you have a child that is currently on SSI benefits and you as a parent come into some money, say, for example, through a settlement of a personal injury case, then that asset that you just got, maybe it's $25,000, can pop you up over that limit, disqualifying your child for SSI benefits. So just be aware that they are constantly going to be looking at your assets. The Social Security Administration will also look at parental income. If your household income is over a certain limit, then your child, no matter how medically disabled he or she is, will simply not qualify for benefits. The amount of household income will change, obviously based on what year it is, also the number of earners in the household, the source of that money. Are you earning the money or is it non-earned money? And then the number of disabled and not disabled children in a household. So as an example, because I'm making this video in 2025, if you have a 4-person household, so you have 2 parents who are both working, 1 disabled child and 1 not disabled child, then if the gross household income is more than $65,000 per year, the child will not qualify for SSI benefits. If you're in a 3-person household, so a single parent with 1 disabled and 1 not disabled child, then the cutoff is around $53,000. And so those are just general numbers. Certainly you would want to either specifically ask the Social Security Administration whether or not you qualify, or there are calculators that are available out on the internet. The Social Security Administration will also look at whether or not the disabled child is receiving child support. Child support is income that is deemed to the child, and so the Social Security Administration will deduct a portion of that from any SSI benefits that that child may be due. So that covers the non-medical criteria. I do understand and absolutely empathize that some of these gross incomes I gave can be considered to be fairly low, especially depending on where you live in the country and if you have a disabled child who is medically needy. But those are the rules for child SSI. I will note that once the child turns 18, there is no more parental deeming because that child is now an adult. And so parental income and assets go away at that point. So, assuming that the child qualifies under the non-medical criteria for child SSI, I'm now going to turn to address the medical side of child disability. And I'm going to start that by stating the obvious. Child disability has to be different than how you figure out whether or not an adult is disabled. Because with adults, we are constantly asking the question, well, can you work? And if you can't work, why not? So for example, as an adult, if you have a heart attack, the question is, how do your medical conditions prevent you from working? And so then we're going to talk about medical restrictions like fatigue, shortness of breath, weakness, and so on. But for children, we don't ask that question. And that's because we're not sending children to work unless you live in Florida. Instead, we look at the child's disabilities, and there are two different ways for a child to be found disabled under Social Security criteria. One is through the childhood listings, and we'll talk about those, and the other one is through the functional domains. For the listings, if a child's condition is severe enough, then he or she will just be automatically disabled. For the domains, we are going to compare the child to other children without impairments. And based on that comparison, we then determine whether or not the child meets the disability requirements. So first, let's look at the childhood listings. So this is a screenshot from the child listings for Social Security. Sometimes it's also called the Bluebook. And as you can see, they are divided based on body systems. There are skin disorders, neurologic disorders, issues with the senses like eyesight or hearing. Some examples that we can throw in here, for example, would be Down syndrome. If your child has documentation of the inherited extra chromosome for Down syndrome, then that child is automatically medically disabled. But for most conditions under the Bluebook, it is not enough that a child has a diagnosis. There also is a severity requirement that goes with that diagnosis. Autism is an example of that. And then the one I have up here is cerebral palsy. It is not enough for a child to have been diagnosed with cerebral palsy, but the child has to have it of such a severe nature that they have difficulties in two of their extremities, so two arms, two legs, and also have extreme limitations in their ability to move. Extreme meaning that they require a walker, that they require a wheelchair. So simply having the condition is not enough to meet the disability requirements under the listings. Now, you may find that shocking that you could have a diagnosis like cerebral palsy and not be found disabled under childhood listings. But I think that will also give you an insight that being found disabled as a child is actually quite difficult. And as we are going to discuss, it is not enough that your child have an IEP, which is, an individual education plan. It is not enough that your child is below grade level. There are severity requirements that are quite steep in order for a child to be found disabled by the Social Security Administration. And so then that brings us to the other way in which children can be found disabled, and that is through the 6 functional domains, which the Social Security Administration calls the whole child approach. Those 6 domains are acquiring and using information, attending and completing tasks, interacting and relating with others, moving about and manipulating objects, caring for yourself, and health and physical well-being. It is important to note that a child can have limitations in more than one domain. So a common example might be a child with severe ADHD. That child may have problems with acquiring and using information because they can't concentrate long enough to learn the information and to be able to give it back. That same child might also have issues attending and completing tasks because they're highly distractible and highly impulsive and need to constantly be redirected. That same child might also have problems in caring for himself because maybe the impulsivity means that they don't think about, oh, I shouldn't run out into the road, or maybe I need to stay close to my parents. And so then that then comes into taking care of yourself. So a child with ADHD may have limitations in multiple domains. And so a child is going to be evaluated in these 6 categories, which begs the question, how does Social Security determine how a child is functioning in these domains? And we're going to get into that. But first, we're going to have to do a little bit of background information and we're going to have to look at some statistics. And I promise you will understand, so just bear with me while we go through this. All right, so we're going to start here with this first slide, and we're going to start here with a bell curve. And we're going to talk about what that is and how that relates to populations. And we're also going to define the words moderate, marked, and extreme, which all have precise definitions for Social Security. So when we look at bell curves, we use these statistically to represent data across populations. And of course, here we're going to be talking about populations of people and populations of children. And as we know, within any group of people, most everyone is going to be average, with some people on one end and some people on the other end. So in this particular graphic, as an example, I have overlaid the height of 100 American men. And as you can see, the average height here is running around 5'9" or 5'10", whereas some men are very tall in the 6 and 6.5 foot range and maybe even taller, and some men are shorter, more down into the 5 foot range. And of course, the further out you go on this bell curve, the more extreme those things are. And so you can have people in the 7 foot range, but there's not very many people that are that tall. And, of course, as this bell curve shows, that center section is where most everybody is. And again, that's going to be average. So with statistics, we can then what we call normalize the data by talking about standard deviations. And that's going to be a specific moving out from that center point. And we can plot that in a population. So we have the mean, which you may remember from high school, means the average, that's that middle line, the 50th percentile right there in the middle. And then if we move out one standard deviation, that's about 34% of the population. And if we move out another, that's another 14%, and another that's about 2%. And then we go out another standard deviation, and now we're at like 0.1% of the population. And that works obviously in both directions on this nice even curve we have. And so we can take that information and then apply terms that you're more familiar with, like average. Basically everybody's average, that middle, 34% on both sides of the 50th percentile. We can also add on terms like above average and below average. And so I've overlaid that here on this bell curve so you can see where those terms come in. And so now what I'm going to do is overlay the Social Security definitions. So the Social Security Administration would call that 13.6% of the population that we have as below average. They would call that a moderate limitation. If you go out another standard deviation, that is going to be marked. So that's kind of that bottom 2%, 2 to 3%. And then extreme, kind of there in that darker red color, is your bottom 0.1% of the population. And, we can change that data to percentiles. And percentiles is probably something that you've seen on your child's test scores. It'll have a score, and then out to the side of it, it'll have percentiles. Marked is in the 2nd to 3rd percentile, and extreme is less than the 1st percentile. So a lot of times it'll be like less than 0.1. And so here's an example of something you might see for a test score that you might be looking at in your child's report. So 100 is average, standard deviations tend to be 15. So in this particular case, this child scored a 66 on working memory and a 79 on their processing speed. That 66 is within the 2nd to 3rd percentile. So Social Security would call that marked. The processing speed would be considered moderate. And this is where child cases start to become really, really difficult. When you start looking at testing scores, a lot of these children who are struggling, they have IEPs, they are below grade level, they have diagnosed disabilities like ADHD and learning disabilities. And when you look at their test scores are falling in the moderate range. Moderate is not enough. And that's going to be if you're skimming down your percentiles, 10th percentile, 15th, 8th, 25th. All of those are considered to be below average and moderate under Social Security standards. And it's unfortunately not low enough. And I know that that's a terrible thing to say, but those are the criteria from the Social Security Administration. So here is a very specific listing to give you another idea of how this plays out. This is listing 112.05 for intellectual disability. And I picked this one because odds are if your child has an IEP, they've probably had psychoeducational testing that would have included some sort of an IQ score. IQ scores are averaged on 100 with deviations upward and downward. The standard deviation is 15. So for Social Security purposes, you are entering into the marked area if your child is scoring a 70 or below. There are a lot of children who are struggling who have IQ scores in the upper 70s and low 80s. That is classified as borderline intellectually disabled, but that score on its own is not going to be enough to meet Social Security disability standards. Um, for a child to be found disabled under these functional domains, the child must be marked in two categories. So remember, that's the bottom 2 to 3%, or extreme in one category, which is the bottom 0.1%. As you probably are gathering from the stuff that we've looked at, that's the child is struggling a lot, and this is a very, very high burden. So please understand that if you have already applied and you get that letter back that says, while your child has some limitations, they are not disabled, and then you get offended because you're like, no, my child has disabilities. It's not that they are saying your child does not have documented disabilities. They are saying that they do not meet the severity standard of marked and extreme to meet the standards for the Social Security Administration. I do want to emphasize that when we talk about these functional domains, we are looking at this based on a child's age, because obviously we expect different things out of a 13-year-old than we do out of a 5-year-old. And so when we say, well, they're in the bottom 2%, that's going to be based on their age. How do they compare to other 15-year-olds? How does this child compare to other 5-year-olds, and so on? Another point I want to make is that if a child is very young, this process of functional domains is also a lot harder. A 5-year-old has not had a lot of testing, especially not compared with, say, a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old. And this comes back to, well, how do we prove that the child is functioning in the bottom 2%? The other difficulty with young children is there are also a lot of interventions that are going on, especially if you're in Head Start pre-K, pre-K through early elementary schools. There's a lot of work that is done within special education to really help these kids and give them a lot of interventions to try to make up for the child maybe not functioning with his or her peers. Um, so it's a little bit early sometimes when they're 6 and 7 years old to know if the deficit that they're having is going to remain a deficit or if they're going to make up that ground. I personally, having done a lot of these cases, consider sometime around age 10 to be kind of the magic age for, are we looking at a child who will meet disability standards or not? Because at that point, which is like fourth, fifth grade, we are starting to have a good amount of testing. The child probably has an IEP in place. There's going to be teachers that we can talk to. Child is probably being pulled out for extra resource learning and so on. And so age 10 is going to be a lot easier to say, no, look at the testing scores, we're in the bottom 2%, versus a 6-year-old who is maybe just entering into kindergarten and we are not even really sure where things are at that moment. And so that's just kind of to put a mark there for you as a parent to think about. Is my child 3 years old? Is my child 10 years old? Is my child 15 years old? Because the information that we have to prove the case is obviously going to be very different given those different age brackets. So at this point, what I want to do is work our way through all of these functional domains fairly quickly. And then at the end of this, I'm going to specifically address autism because that is something that comes up quite a bit. So the first functional domain is acquiring and using information. And this is kind of how it sounds. This is the child's ability to learn and to think about and to utilize the information that the child has been given. It is more than just cognitive ability. They're going to be looking at a whole lot of different things. So can the child learn how to tie their shoe and then repeat that pattern? Can the child learn something in one situation and apply it in a different situation? And again, all age appropriate. Attending and completing tasks. This is our second domain. This is the child's ability to focus and maintain attention age appropriately. Can they perform a task at an appropriate pace? How much redirection does this child need? They also consider the child's ability to change focus after completing a task. I do want to mention, because this is the one that comes up a lot with ADHD, the Social Security Administration is going to consider a child's functioning while on medication. So for a lot of kids with ADHD, they perform much better while on a medication than not on a medication. If the child is improving on medication, then Social Security is going to evaluate how they are doing when they are on their medication. So just keep that in mind. The next functional domain is interacting and relating with others. We see this one come up a lot more with our autism cases. Does the child understand social reciprocity? Do we understand that we stand in line and we take turns and we share and we take turns as who's playing? How do we respond when somebody says something to us that we don't like? Then obviously, again, age appropriate, but that's, interacting and relating with others. Do they interact with adults properly? Do they interact with children appropriately? Speech and language skills go under this domain. So if you have a child that has some speech impairments, if they are severe enough, it may be extreme within this particular functional domain. The next one, moving about and manipulating objects. We're going to look at both gross motor skills, so riding a bike, kicking a ball, running, as well as fine motor skills, zippers, buttons, tying a shoe. Can the child hold a pencil appropriately? That's going to be in moving about and manipulating objects. Caring for yourself. There's kind of two different things that I look at with caring for yourself. One of them is, do we understand safety rules? We don't run out in traffic. We don't jump off of high walls. We don't do things that are physically risky that, a child should be able to think maybe that's not a safe thing to do. The other thing in caring for yourself that comes up a lot with kids that are either on the spectrum or with ADHD or some of these mood disorders is, can the child calm themselves down age appropriately? If something makes the child upset and sees red and is flailing on the floor, can the child self-soothe and have emotionally appropriate ways of interacting with adults for asking for reassurance? Are they able to maintain a healthy emotional and physical state? Finally, the last domain is health and physical well-being. This is kind of our catch-all. So if a child is very sick a lot, the recurrent illnesses in and out of the hospital, side effects from medication, it's kind of a general, there's a lot of medical neediness with whatever is going on with a child that might be evaluated in their health and physical well-being. So that is our total of our 6 domains. Remember, of course, again, that for a child to be found disabled under these domains, they either need to be marked in 2 categories or extreme in 1. I do want to reiterate that when a child turns 18, these criteria no longer apply. If you have a child that is found disabled as a child, then when that child turns 18, what will happen is the Social Security Administration will reevaluate that child under adult criteria to determine whether or not they continue to be disabled. So I'm going to pause here and throw in a slide specifically to speak to autism. And that is because I get a lot of calls from parents whose child is diagnosed with autism and they want to know about applying for disability benefits. This particular one is hard because autism, as you are all aware of, is on a spectrum. We talk about the autism spectrum. And if you've listened through this video, then you know that disabilities that are on a spectrum are going to have a severity requirement attached. Autism is the same. It is not enough to have a child that has been diagnosed with autism to meet the medical criteria for childhood disability benefits. So let's work through this. For autism, professionals, so that's going to be psychologists, psychiatrists, pediatricians, etc., are going to use the DSM-5 to diagnose autism. Per the new DSM-5 criteria, there is no longer a recognition of what we used to call Asperger's or high-functioning autism. They did away with that term and instead are just talking about autism as a spectrum. So if you had a child that maybe is older and at one point was diagnosed Asperger's, that is generally similar to what we call a level 1 autism. And so autism now is ranked either 1, 2, or 3, depending on the level of support that a child needs. So level 1 autism is a child who does require support. These are children who may have some problems with social interactions, may have some rigidity in thought, engage in some problematic behaviors. I often see these children with maybe a co-diagnosis of ADHD, oppositional defiance, OCD, or maybe a mood disorder or borderline intellectual disability. These things all kind of circulate around each other. Level 1 autism on its own is not likely going to be enough for disability benefits. Because remember, for disability, we are looking at children that are marked and extreme. Children with level 1 autism are generally going to be more in the moderate category. So a lot of times these children, especially with some support, do well enough in school that they're not going to be down in that marked and extreme, those marked and extreme levels. I will say that sometimes the co-diagnoses can come into play. And so if you have a child with level 1 autism with very severe oppositional defiance, you may still meet criteria, but it's probably not going to be based solely on the autism. Children that are level 2 are going to have more delays and larger deficits in nonverbal social communication skills. These children tend to be very inflexible with their behaviors, and they may qualify for disability, but that's going to be very, very individual. If a child is level 2, but maybe closer to level 1, it again may not be severe enough. Level 3, of course, is the most severe. This child would likely meet a listing, and I've put the listing over there on the side. These are kids that require very substantial support with severe deficits and likely have delays in multiple spheres of life. So these are children that are maybe mostly nonverbal with very severe restricted and repetitive patterns. And so that's your level 3. So I wanted to put this in here because I do get a lot of calls from parents with children with level 1 autism asking about disability benefits. And based on my experience, at least in the state of Georgia, level 1 autism on its own is probably not going to meet disability criteria. So now that we have that out of the way, the question then becomes, well, how do we prove a child disability case? And I will say that these are cases that really, really require a group effort. So from a parental standpoint, it's important to be getting your child to their appointments because we need medical statements and we need medical sources to talk about a child's disabilities. It is your job to advocate for your child, to get them the supports that they need, and to be compliant with treatment. It's very hard to argue severe ADHD if a child could be on medication but is not, because again, that's going to be a question mark that the judge may have as well. If your child can function on medication, why aren't you doing it? And that's not to say that you should be required to do that, but it would raise a question mark as to how disabled is this child when we're looking at ADHD. Doctors and therapists are necessary because we need medical records. We need them to answer questionnaires. Teachers in the schools have to be a part of this because that's where our IEPs and 504 plans are coming from. This is our testing scores, our questionnaires. If you are getting notes back and forth from the school, hang on to those notes from the teacher because that can be used to show ongoing behavioral problems. And then finally, of course, with the group effort would be an attorney, such as myself. I do child cases. There are other attorneys also that do child cases. I will say they are definitely more difficult because a lot of things are more in the gray area. And so we really, really need all of this documentation in order to have a really strong child case. So that is a deep dive into disability benefits for children. This is a video that's been a while in the making. I've had these PowerPoint slides for a while because I think a lot of attorneys don't do child cases and they don't talk to parents about what is expected in a child case. A lot of parents think that because they have a diagnosis, we should automatically be granted disability, and it just doesn't work that way. They're just not very cut and dry. The severity level is quite high, and these can be very, very difficult cases to prove. But I hope that helps and at least gives you an idea of the criteria and kind of what you're facing if you're looking at applying for disability benefits for a child. If you're in the Georgia area and would like some help with your disability case, please feel free to reach out to me at georgiaadvocatepartners.com. You can also feel free to drop me a question in the comments. I'll do my best to answer it. If there's a specific thing that you would like for me to go over in a future video, feel free to drop that down there as well, or send me a note on georgiaadvocatepartners.com. Thank you so much. I know this has been a longer video, and I will see you on the next one.